Emotions matter. Emotional intelligence is a critical 21st century skill, and companies with emotionally intelligent leadership teams have a distinct competitive advantage. Today, people leaders must not only master their own emotions, but also use strategies to support emotions at work, to create a more productive, supportive, and energizing work environment for all. But this is a fairly new reality. For most of the 20th century, productivity and efficiency were how employees were measured. And as such, emotions were deemed a liability. You can't take a moment when you have an entire assembly team depending on you to do your part in a given time frame. We all know that humans are not robots. And today we actually have the robots to complete assembly line work, which means the skills required in today's workplace have fundamentally changed. And this is not easy. As much as we try to contain it, emotions can be messy, distracting, debilitating, contagious, and they can impact relationships within the team and even with current and potential customers, for better or worse. So what should we do about this? First, be aware of yourself and those around you. Naming the emotion is the first step of controlling its power. Next, check in regularly with your team through open and honest conversations. You cannot fake this if you want to maintain the trust of your team. So be as transparent and vulnerable as you're able to. Finally, encourage the positive. Recognize the good behavior. Remind your team to be mindful and provide an outlet for employees to express themselves without recourse. After all, we are human beings, not human doings. So let's be the leaders that know and see and welcome that reality. I'm Neely Adkins, and we are the RecogNATION. Welcome to the RecogNATION. My name is Neely. I'm here, as always, with Kaylee. Savona, Kaylee, how is it?
It's great.
It is great.
How is it for you?
It's great. It is March Madness. And what that means is not just a basketball tournament, but like literal madness. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the sun is out. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's raining. Sometimes it's not. Craziness is abound. But let's talk about basketball really quick. Do you do brackets?
I do for fun. I don't follow college basketball very closely at all. I like Michigan basketball, but I wouldn't be able to like make accurate picks. I just like to have fun and make a bracket and guess or pick some of the underdogs because really, who really knows?
Who really knows?
You got some crazy stuff going on in college basketball. So
it's a mystery. Yeah, it's just an interesting like societal thing for all of us to get together and then draw lines on pieces of paper and then make guesses and then like sit around and watch TV for several weekends in a row. Anyway.
And every year we have hope that someone will make the perfect bracket,
story.
Which is impossible, but we just have the hope.
Do you think that's what drives it is hope?
Maybe, yeah, I do. I think someone thinks they're special. Everyone thinks they're going to be that one person that magically creates the perfect bracket.
Is that the magic of sports?
That's the magic of sports.
I think we've unlocked something. Anyway, we had a great conversation with Natalie Boudou, who is the founder of HumanForce. She's actually based out of Switzerland, so our conversation had a little time zone action going there, but shared some great tips on recognizing human emotions and how to work with them in the workplace. What were some key takeaways from that conversation?
A few of the ones sticking out in my mind are really coming from those tools that she had near the beginning of the episode for working with your emotions. One of them is being able to identify when they're manifesting physically and where those manifest in our bodies. Like a knot forms in your throat when you're nervous, or when you're really angry, you like get a headache or your vision goes blurry. I think there's so many ways that we can listen to our physical bodies to understand our emotions. And then a couple other, I guess, just highlights were labeling your emotions, knowing when to dial up and dial down your emotions, but not ignore them completely. So there were just a lot of great tips in there for leaders.
I think the common thread for this was self-awareness and mindfulness and sort of knowing yourself and being aware. That's probably a challenge that everyone can probably step up and try to be better at. I think what was also interesting is the concept of loneliness, especially, since the pandemic and working remote or hybrid, what impact loneliness can have at a subconscious level, right? Mm-hmm. That you don't realize that loneliness is impacting you in certain ways. So part of that mindfulness journey is being more aware of what impact working alone in an environment on a regular basis is having. So really a tremendous long conversation. I think we had a lot of questions for Natalie. So please enjoy Natalie Boudou. We are here with Natalie Boudou, who is the founder of HumanForce, which is a strategic consulting, training, and coaching organization. Natalie's also the author of The Human Force, The Power of Emotions in a Changing Workplace. Natalie, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here as well.
Natalie, so you clearly have a diverse background and varied experiences with different organizations when it comes to definitely the human element of work, which I'm excited to dive into. But just as sort of an introduction, would you mind giving our audience just a summary of your background and what brought you here today?
Yes, well, I've had quite a diverse background, as you say, Neely. I started out my career as a lawyer, and then I worked in many different legal roles. Working with a big law firm and then in-house. And I was also a communication specialist for about 12 years, working with the United Nations here in Geneva and also with various other organizations in the area. And then about 12 years ago, I moved into coaching, requalified, and I wanted to really go back to the workplace and try and help leaders and try and help teams to build workplaces where people care, where people connect, and where people thrive. And so that's what I did. And I started training and consulting in a variety of companies as well as coaching, and developed programs for leaders, for teams, to bring out that human element at work, which is so important and so powerful. And when I founded HumanForce, the concept behind it is really to enable everybody in the workplace to bring their human selves, to bring their whole selves to work. That we don't actually just have a workforce, we have a human force, actually. And that when people's human qualities and human powers are leveraged, then that's when they thrive, and that's when they do their best for the organization. So that's the background to my journey. And then in about a month's time, on the 4th of April, I have my first book coming out. So I'm very excited about that. And that's really a culmination of all the work that I've done over the years and a desire to impact as many people as possible. And hopefully a book will help me to reach even more people than I currently can. And that's really the thinking behind it.
Yeah, congrats on the book too. That's coming out. It sounds incredible. I love that idea of changing workforce to human force. And one of the biggest themes that we want to cover today is emotions in the workplace, because of course, as humans, we are emotional beings and we can't just turn that off when we go to work. So I think a great place to start would actually be, if you don't mind kind of running through those 7 tools for working with emotions at work. I think that would be a really great piece to start with for our leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, there's a chapter which is called Working with Emotions. And that's really the bit about self-leadership. So how do you, as an individual, work with your emotions, which is really, really important. It really all starts with paying attention, with being aware of how you feel, because weirdly enough, a lot of us are not aware of how we feel. I know that sounds strange, but we're running around, we're chasing our tails, we're super busy. And so do we have the time or the opportunity to actually get in touch with how we feel? So the first tool that we talk a lot about, and you've probably heard it, in many different areas, is that of mindfulness. And how when we are mindful, when we are in the present, when we connect to what we're doing, we can become aware of lots of things. We can become aware of our thoughts that are going on in our head, but we can also become aware of our emotions. And then we can actually work with them or do something about it if it's causing us suffering or if it's causing us a problem. So really the first step is really to pay attention. That's really important. How you pay attention and how you observe what's going on in the moment. That's really, really important. The second tool that we talk about is actually being able to look at what happens in the day. Take an inventory of your emotions. Emotions are very much about energy. At the end of the day, where have you spent your time? Have you spent your time in the high emotions of joy and excitement, or in the high energy sapping emotions of anger or frustration? To become aware, and we have a tool there where it helps you become aware of where you are. And if you're on the wrong side of the grid of that tool, how can you work towards redressing the balance and really becoming aware of where you are? Another tool that we give in the book is around feeling, and how you can do certain exercises to actually become aware of where you feel your emotions. So, for example, if I'm sad, I tend to feel that a little bit here in my throat. And if I'm angry, maybe I feel it in my stomach. And we're all different, and we all feel emotions in different ways. And emotions are meant to be felt. And that feeling can give you a clue as to what's going on, especially if you're running around like mad. Sometimes that tummy ache or that headache or that neck pain will give you some information. So developing the ability to feel in your body is a really great way to become an emotional detective. Because what we're talking about really is being that emotional detective. Another tool is around labeling emotions. So how you label them. A lot of people will struggle to tell you how they feel. They may have just 6 or 7 emotions that come to mind, but actually there are so many of them. So actually becoming familiar with all the different emotions that we can feel and being able to label them is great. And also research shows that when you label an emotion, immediately the stress, the tension that you might be feeling goes down. Scientifically, that's what happens in the body. So being able to say, I feel sad, is really half the battle. What you do with that afterwards is also interesting, but labeling it is a really positive thing. The next tool is around understanding what's going on. So once you've identified, you've felt, and you've labeled, what does that mean? What's behind it? What's going on? What's just happened? Why am I feeling this? What might be behind the feeling? So there you're going a bit deeper and you're delving into the why you're feeling that, to be able to start working with that. So that's another really important step. There are a couple of other sort of tools we talk about, which are how you regulate. So whatever's going to happen, you're going to have an emotion, because we have hundreds and thousands of emotions on a daily basis. And sometimes you want to dial them up because they're useful. And sometimes you want to dial them down because they're not helpful. And so you have to be able to regulate. So we have some strategies in the book around how you regulate them in the moment. You're in a meeting, somebody says something to you that's not great, and you want to react, and you're feeling the anger, or you're feeling something happening. How do you control yourself? How do you manage those emotions in the moment? So there are tools in there, a lot around breathing, around taking pauses. Those kind of tips are in there about regulating in the short term. And then there's the last piece is regulating in the long term, because emotional hygiene, so how you handle your emotions over a long period of time, counts as well. So the practices that you can put in place, for example, at the end of the day, when you come home and you've had a day full of emotion, what do? How do you wash it away? How do you squeeze that sponge? And so there are all sorts of tips for that as well. So I think those are kind of the main tools in there. I don't know if that's given you a good idea.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I think those are amazing. I especially love the ideas, I guess multiple ideas in there, labeling your emotions, dialing up and dialing down. And then also you talked about, I guess, that physical feeling of where is that emotion manifesting in you physically. I think there's just so much value in all of those tips. And so I guess my next question is, what happens if people ignore their emotions, or instead of dialing up and dialing down, they just try to shove all of those emotions down and maybe not even necessarily acknowledge them, or they acknowledge them and they say, you know what, I don't need to be feeling that. I'm just going to completely shove it away. Is that when burnout happens? I guess, what does that look like? Yeah,
that's a really good question, actually. And that's something that I tackle quite early on in the book. I mean, I kind of give a metaphor for what happens when an emotion happens in your body. The metaphor that I give is it's a bit like an email coming in. The email has a message for you, okay? The emotions are messages, and they come into your body a bit like emails. And you can choose to click on that email and open the email and get the message, right? Or you can choose to ignore the email. But you can be pretty sure that if you ignore the email, it's going to spam you later, and it's going to stay in that junk box, and it's going to come back and spam you again. So the short answer is that you really should be clicking on the email, and you should be dealing with your emotion, because they will not go away. The strong emotions will not go away. So the cost of not clicking on that emotion, well, there are various costs. You've probably heard of people who brood, right? Maybe they ruminate. I don't know if you have people who ruminate and go over and over things. Or maybe they're bottling everything up. That's another behavior that we have. We bottle everything up until it's too much, and then we explode. And these are not appropriate behaviors. These are behaviors which cause chronic stress in people, and ultimately which can lead to ill health. And you won't be surprised to know that a lot of people who are chronically stressed, or who are doing badly in terms of their mental health, a lot of it is because they haven't processed their emotions, or they haven't worked with their emotions properly. So yes, very important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what a great analogy too with the emails. I'm actually going to keep with that analogy for a second. So I actually just really quick want to ask you how the pandemic plays into this, because I think if we stick with that analogy, we were all getting spammed with emotional emails during that time. Just email after email, emotions were high. So do you think that has kind of forever changed emotions in the workplace? Did people realize that we do actually have to pay attention to emotions more? How do you think the pandemic has affected the way that people and leaders think about emotions?
Well, Kaylee, there were a lot of bad things about the pandemic. It was a terrible time. But the one good thing I think that's come out of it, but it's still to be proven because we've still got a way to go, is that suddenly emotions were at the forefront in the workplace. I'd been working with leaders and teams well before the pandemic, really pushing to get these programs on emotions in the workplace. And I had done quite a bit of work already, but suddenly the pandemic brought this to the forefront. Managers could no longer avoid this subject. They were having to look after their teams and worry about how their teams were doing. And so it suddenly brought the whole subject to the forefront. And so I think that, although the pandemic is only really just behind us, I think there's a lot of work to do. But I've seen a change in my industry, in the work that I'm doing. I'm getting more requests for my work and for my help to help teams, to help managers deal with the emotions. And then I think there's another element to the emotions, which I touch upon in my book, which is that what we saw in the pandemic is that people who were, particularly people working all remotely, and many people working, from home, it may be single people or whatever, they became lonely. And loneliness since the pandemic has really risen. And there are so many surveys now which I could point to, which will tell you how much of an epidemic loneliness is. And so what we're seeing now is a greater need for emotional connection. People are looking for emotional connection, and they want that from their workplace. And so again, this whole topic of emotions, and in the larger context of an emotional connection, has become a burning issue, I think, for companies. And if it isn't, it should be.
So Natalie, I couldn't help as I'm listening to your tools, and then also, the behaviors that, or the outcomes, if we go into full ignore mode, what that does to a person. I could not help but recognize that, a typical corporate approach to human emotions is absolutely dial it down. It is absolutely leave it at the door. This is not the place for that. So then enter pandemic, that then forces not just corporate motions, but leadership to now need to flex into an emotional connection with their team members that they had no previous experience doing, that they have no knowledge or training or any of those things, that leads to a great reshuffle in which individuals are saying, I don't feel connected to this team, to this organization, because I have always been a cog in the wheel rather than a person that is part of a team. So just am I off on saying that, it is a great redistribution of leverage that is now in that employee, that team member, that is, I need to be recognized and given the opportunity to bring myself to this work. I can no longer separate what is work mode versus human mode.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in what you just said, Neely. I mean, there's just sort of picking up on some of the thoughts there. Is I think that there's a burden for leaders today. It's hard, it's tough, because they are now having to learn these skills. I mean, we've been talking about emotional intelligence for 20, 30 years, right? But what it means essentially in that emotional intelligence is the word emotion. I think we forget that sometimes. And managers are now faced with the reality that actually this counts, this is important, and it's not easy. I mean, the good news is that the skills that we talk about in the book, they can be learned. That's the great news, is that these skills can be learned. And I really hate, I really hate the way people call them soft skills, because they're not soft, they're hard. They're hard skills, but they can be learned. And so that's really, the aim of my work is to help leaders to learn these skills, to help them to connect to their teams, to help them to create that emotional connection. And I think also what's increasingly difficult as well, which is hard for managers, is that we're now having to manage emotions in a remote way. So we have hybrid teams. So we have to manage the emotional connection in a hybrid team, which just adds a layer of complexity to the whole thing. So I don't want to sound too down on it, because it is in a way, to shed a positive note on it, it's an opportunity. If anything, I think, this is what I say in my book, and I feel strongly that leaders are standing now on the threshold of being able to make a difference and to do it differently. And it's an opportunity, if anything, now. But if they just have to grasp it, and organizations have to realize how important it is. But it's an opportunity for everybody, I think.
So while we're on the topic of emotions at work, I'd love to dive a little bit into your TED Talk, because I really liked that you talked about fear in that. And I think fear is interesting. We often fear change, and I think we fear new things. So how do you think that fear can be a good thing? Because I think you kind of allude to that in your talk, that it's important to sit with that. So do you mind diving a little bit into the importance of fear? Yeah,
sure. I mean, we're living in a world where everything is changing constantly, and that's incredible in the workplace now. The amount of changes that we have to deal with, all of us, on a daily basis, whether it's reorganizations or technical changes or technology, it's crazy. And you can be sure that when change happens, emotions are involved, right? And the main emotion that involved is fear, because as humans, our brains, we're not really wired to like change. We're kind of wired to prefer predictability. So when change happens, we have a reaction very much like our ancestors and the cavemen did. We go on alert. And that provokes a reaction in our brain, and it stimulates the emotion of fear. So it's, you've probably heard of the fight, flight, or freeze. That's what often happens to people when change occurs. And some people fight, some people fly, and some people freeze. But we'll have a reaction of some sort. What I found over the course of my work, and also, doing the TED Talk and writing a book, is that actually fear, if it's worked well with, it can be a really powerful thing, because you can't avoid it. So what do? You can't avoid it. If you try and push it to one side, you don't open the email that we talked about earlier, it's going to come back and bite you. People who have anxiety disorders, people who have panic attacks, that is often because the fear has not been addressed. It's there. It's still with them. So the approach that I take and that I talk about in the book is that rather than avoid it, or rather than even taking medication, which is what a lot of people do now when they're anxious. Why not do something different? Why not embrace the fear? Why not sort of like sit with that fear? Because research shows, and this is interesting, research shows that when you actually embrace an emotion, or when you welcome an emotion, if you do it in the right way, it disappears. So it will go away. Emotions don't last that long. I think there are various surveys or research on how long an emotion lasts, but it's not really that long. We're talking a matter of seconds. So if you welcome and embrace the emotion, you sit with it, you're not frightened of it, you're not frightened of the fear, what will happen is that gradually it will go away. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that once you sit with it and once you feel it and you're aware of it, then you can perhaps work with it. And that goes back to all the tools that we talked about earlier, about sitting with that fear and then trying to understand what's going on, and whether it's challenging it or whether it's reframing it, or whatever it is, that the other tools that you can do once you've embraced it can be really powerful. And likewise, in the book, I talk about how change management at work, which happens a lot, it's not just an operational process, it's an emotional process. And I think it's really successful in organizations when leaders also take into account the emotions of the people who are going through the change, and to acknowledge that their people are going to be frightened, and to not be frightened, to address that fear. Because when that's done, it's really powerful.
Yeah. Would you also agree that not only can we work with fear once we've labeled it and embraced it, would you say that we also grow when we do that? Because I guess I think of it like when we embrace a fear, when we go out of our comfort zone,
yes,
that typically tends to be the areas in which we end up doing something we didn't think we could do, or we end up growing more. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you're probably familiar, Kaylee, with the concept of the growth mindset, which a lot of companies are talking about, of going outside of your comfort zone, of taking risks. That's what companies want. They want their people to innovate, to create, to do something differently. But guess what? When we go out of our comfort zone, we get frightened. So fear is even there when we're talking about innovation and creativity and doing things differently. So yes, if you can work with it, not ignore it, but accept it as a normal part of everyday life and get comfortable with it, then you can do wonders at work, and you can grow, you can innovate, you can do a lot, you can really achieve your potential.
Thanks for joining us today, and special thanks to The Fracture and Jay Matthews for their original music. Stay tuned for more episodes coming out every week that will touch on the topics that are important to HR and people leaders like you. If you have any recommendations or feedback, or if you are looking to partner on creating a more engaging recognition program, you can contact us at podcast@RecogNATION.com. And as always, thank you.